How's everybody doing this afternoon? Good? All right. First of all, once again, on behalf of the National Park Service, let me welcome you to the Gettysburg National Military Park and our Battle Anniversary Lecture Series. Normally, these would be 2 to 3 hour walking tours of the battlefield, but I think the heat index today was supposed to be about 111. That's why we're having them inside instead. And my particular topic is spying for Longstreet. And of course, his favorite spy, Henry Thomas Harrison. Now, Harrison was born in Nashville, Tennessee on April 23rd, 1832. According to the 1860 census, he was working as a clerk. He enlisted in April of 1861 in the Artillery Rifle Company, later Company I of the 12th Mississippi, which was organized in May of 1861. They arrived in Virginia on July 22nd, just a few days after the Battle of Bull Run. The regiment itself is assigned to the brigade of Brigadier General Robert E. Rhodes in the division commanded by Earl Van Dorn. And that's in the fall of 1861. And that's apparently when Harrison starts his scouting duties. And he's stationed at what's called Camp Van Dorn near Union Mills in Fairfax County, Virginia. And that's when he went on what was called detached duty in September of 1861. Harrison received a discharge for unstated medical reasons on November 18th, 1861. Now, Camp Van Dorn was near a place called Oak Grove. And this just happened to be the home of a Miss Laura Bruders. And of course, Harrison found time to visit Miss Bruders on occasion. On November 5th, 1861, he wrote her a letter. My dear Laura, do not think that I have forgotten you or the kind reception ever extended to me at Oak Grove. But I have been partially restricted in my, I'm going to mess this word up, peregrinations by a severe attack of, I forgot what our surgeon calls it. At any rate, I am aware of being too ill for military duty, although at this present time greatly improved and hope shortly to be able to get about. Forever yours, Harry. Harrison next shows up in Mississippi, and he writes to actually Brigadier General Thomas Jordan, who's the Chief of Staff for General Braxton Bragg. Now, on April 30th, 1862, Harrison wrote, Sir, I am one of the original Mississippi Scouts that served on the Potomac. I wish to immediately enter service here. As I have no horse or equipment, will you be so kind as to make a requisition for them and leave or hand same to Mr. Gorsuch? Harrison next is going to send a letter to Brigadier General William W. Loring. Loring's in command of troops near Vicksburg, Mississippi. And appearing in this letter of January 6, 1863, Harrison included information on General U.S. Grant, his movements, supplies, and transportation facilities. Harrison was listed as a second lieutenant on return for the post of Columbus, Mississippi in July of 1862. On February 20th, 1863, the Confederate Secretary of War James A. Seton was signed a voucher for Harrison, indicating that Harrison is now returned to the Eastern Theater. and operating in Goldsboro, North Carolina, under Longstreet's command. Longstreet said, one night in the spring of 1863, I was sitting in my tent opposite Suffolk, Virginia, when there came in a slender, wiry fellow, about 5'8", with hazel eyes, dark hair and complexion, and brown beard. He wore a citizen's suit of dark material, and except for his stooping shoulders, was well-formed and evidently a man of great activity. He handed me a note from Mr. Sutton that was my first meeting with the famous scout Harrison, who in his unpretending citizen's dress passed unmolested from right to left through the Federal Army, visited Washington City, ate and drank with federal officers. Now, this probably occurred sometime in April when Longstreet shifted his headquarters from Petersburg to Suffolk, Virginia. And the reason Longstreet and two of his divisions are down there are basically to bring in supplies for the Confederate Army. That's why Longstreet isn't present with Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May. Longstreet's very able Chief of Staff, Mark C. Searle, also had a description of Harrison. He was a man of about 30 years, calling himself a Mississippian, and was altogether an extraordinary character. His time seemed to pass about equally within our line and the enemy. Harrison, such was his name, always brought us true information. There was invariable confirmation of his reports afterwards. He went everywhere, even through Stanton's War Office at Washington itself, and brought in much. On the whole, he appears to have been a daring Southerner, hating Yankees most bitterly, but loving their greenbacks, and fond of secret, perilous adventure. Harrison was observed and captured near New Bern, North Carolina, a few days after the attack on Fort Harrison, which occurred on March 14, 1863. And he's questioned by Colonel Jonathan Belknap of the 8th 5th New York, who was also commanding the 1st Brigade, 4th Division, 18th Army Corps. And Harrison is very truthful and forthcoming to Colonel Belknap. He gave his name as H.T. Harrison, stated he was a native of Yazoo County, Mississippi, and had served 6 months in the 12th Mississippi, but discharged for disability. Harrison claimed he was living alternately with a sister in Pitt County and a cousin near Swift Creek. He kept moving to avoid Confederate conscription. He also knew the names of several civilians who were, from Belknap's point of view, inconveniently too far away to be questioned. So since Belknap had nothing else on Harrison, he let him go. But notice how Harrison is very honest about who he is. He's probably making up why he's there, but Belknap has no reason to doubt what he's saying, at least at that point. Longstreet is now going to send Harrison to Washington, D.C. Longstreet said, before we left Fredericksburg, which was on or about June 3rd, 1863, I called up my scout Harrison, and giving him all the gold he thought he would need, I told him to go to Washington City and remain there until he was in possession of information which he knew to be of value to us, and directed that he should then make his way back to me and report. As he was leaving, He asked where he would find me. That was information I did not care to impart to a man who was going directly to the federal capital. I answered that my command was large enough to be found without difficulty. So Longstreet, even though Harrison's his best spy, there's certain information you don't give that spy in case he's captured. And the location of the Confederate Army is one of them. Mark Cicero also remembered this conversation. And the way he put it is, "Where shall I find you, General, to make this report?" asked Harrison. "With the Army," was Longstreet's grim answer. "I shall be sure to be with it." He was very far from giving even his most trusted scout information as to his movements. But Harrison knew all the same. He knew pretty much everything that was going on. On June 10th, 1863, Lee's going to write to Richard Ewell, his Second Corps commander, and he tells him that General John M. Bowden is instructed to communicate to you any intelligence of importance and to comply with any directions you may give him. General Albert Jenkins is establishing a line of couriers between the valley and my headquarters. Their positions you will probably ascertain on your route. So they're not just depending on Harrison. Lee's trying to find other sources of information to try to track the Yankee Army. General Jeb Stuart is going to write to General Beverly Robinson on June 24th. "You will instruct General William E. Grumble Jones from time to time as the movements, progress, or events may require, and report anything of importance to Lieutenant General Longstreet, with whose position you will communicate by relays through Charlestown." Now, how is Harrison going to get from Fredericksburg to Washington, D.C.? Well, believe it or not, there was a secret route for Confederate couriers, sometimes known as the Doctor's Line, that ran through southern Maryland and through the town of Surrattsville, Maryland. And one of the stops in Surrattsville was the Surratt Tavern, run by Mrs. Mary Surratt. And this was known as a stopover for Confederate couriers, including her son, John Surratt. Now, Harrison's route also took him past Oak Grove and probably Miss Laura Bruder's at the same time. His destination is Willard's Hotel in Washington, D.C. And this was a very nice gathering place for Union officers. So you can imagine someone like Harrison with some gold to spend would go in there and offer some of these officers to buy some of these officers a drink and get information that way. Now, Harrison's not the only spy, if you will, in the area. In D.C. itself was William Nelson Conrad, who was considered the leading Confederate spy in Washington. Benjamin Franklin Stringfellow in the middle was one of Jeb Stuart's favorite scouts. And of course, on the right is Confederate Cavalry Commander John Mosby. The problem is Conrad, for some reason, is unable to get out of D.C. safely. Stringfellow was captured on June 12th at Middleburg, Virginia, and Mosby was out of touch with Stuart at this point. It's roughly 40 miles from Washington to Frederick via an old spur of the National Road. It's now Maryland Route 355. It runs from Georgetown Wisconsin Avenue in D.C., and he may have passed under the guns of Fort Reno, one of the biggest forts guarding Washington, D.C. It's now basically a city park. Longstreet reported the moment he, Harrison, heard Hooker had started across the Potomac on or about June 25th, he set out to find me. He fell in with the Federal Army before reaching Frederick, his plan being to walk at night and stop during the day in the neighborhood of the troops. He said there were 3 corps near Frederick when he passed there, one to the right and one to the left, but he did not succeed in getting the position of the other. Now, I figured out a man can walk roughly about 2 miles an hour. Okay? And I don't think he's actually walking the whole way from D.C. to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. I think he had to pick up a horse somewhere along the way. And a horse can walk 4 miles an hour, and at a trot, about 8 miles an hour. An average trail horse can cover roughly 50 miles in one day at a walk. Okay? It's 25 miles now from Hagerstown, from Frederick to Hagerstown on the old National Road, which, if you're coming out of Frederick, is now alternate 40. Okay? From Baltimore to Frederick, the old National Road is Route 40. For some reason, when you get on the other side of Frederick, the road splits. And modern 40 kind of goes off this way, and alternate 40 goes off this way, which is the National Road. Okay? When you get to Hagerstown, new 40 alternate 40 stops, and the National Road now becomes 40 again. Okay? That 40 from Frederick to Hagerstown was intended as a bypass. And they said it saved you 1.25 miles by putting that bypass in. So, but it gets confusing. So just remember, if you're trying to follow Harrison's route out of Frederick, you want alternate 40. Okay? That's the National Road. He's going to pass through, he crosses the Catoctin Mountain, which locally is known as Braddock Mountain. He's going to pass through Middletown, Maryland, which was 8 miles from Frederick and 19 miles from Hagerstown. I estimate Harrison left Frederick, Maryland, probably no later than about 3 o'clock in the morning of June 28th, if not sometime on the 27th. So that's the time frame. Harrison will also pass through Turner's Gap, the scene of a battle in September of 1862, and it'll pass by the old South Mountain Inn, which has been operating in one fashion or another since 1732. It is now owned by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. What they're going to do with it, I have no idea. So Harrison's going to arrive in Hagerstown. It's another 25 miles from Hagerstown to Chambersburg along what was called the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road, or the Cumberland Valley Turnpike. In the Shenandoah Valley, it's simply the Valley Turnpike. But today, it's basically US 11. That's the sort of the trace of the Valley Turnpike. So from Frederick to Chambersburg is roughly 50 miles. Okay? And he'll arrive in Chambersburg approximately 17 hours from Frederick. That's about how long it's going to take them to get there. Lee and Longstreet have established their headquarters about 3/4 of a mile west from the Chambersburg town square. Today, if you're driving into Chambersburg, on the right-hand side, there's a Dollar Tree. That's the area where Lee had his headquarters, okay, at Mrs. Smith's Woods. On the left-hand side of the road, you're going to see a Pizza Hut, and behind that is the Lincoln Cemetery. Somewhere between the road and the cemetery, Longstreet will have his headquarters. Okay? And we know they're pretty close together, especially from the way people are talking about things going on. Mark Cicero is going to report, or he's going to remember, at night I was roused by a detail of the provost guard bringing up a suspicious prisoner. I knew him instantly. It was Harrison, the scout, filthy and ragged, showing some rough work and experience. He had come to report to the general, who was sure to be with the army. And truly his report was long and valuable. Harrison gave us the first complete account of the operations of the enemy since Hooker left out front. He brought his report down to a day or two and described how they were even then marching in great numbers in the direction of Gettysburg, with intention of concentrating there. Harrison's report was so exceedingly important that I took him at once with me and woke Longstreet. He was immediately on fire at such news and sent the scout by a staff officer to General Lee's camp nearby. Longstreet, in his official report, my pages are sticking a little bit. There we go. Longstreet, in his official report, is going to say, on the night of the 28th, one of my scouts came in with information that the enemy had passed the Potomac and was probably in pursuit of us. The scout was sent to General Headquarters with a suggestion that our army concentrate east of the mountains and bear down to meet the enemy. Now, that's just the first report. In his memoirs, published in 1898, Longstreet said, at about 10 o'clock that night, Colonel Sorrell was waked by an orderly who reported that a suspicious person had just been arrested by the provost marshal. Upon investigation, Sorrell discovered that the suspicious person was the scout Harrison. He was dirt-stained, travel-worn, and very much broken down. After questioning him sufficiently to find that he brought very important information, Colonel Sorrell brought him to my headquarters and awoke me. He gave me the information that the enemy had crossed the Potomac, marched northwest, and that the head of the column was at Frederick City on our right. Longstreet is then going to send Harrison to Lee and follows up with a personal meeting the following morning, suggesting a change of direction of the head of our column to the right. And Longstreet had already issued those orders. Now, this is the itinerary of the Army of the Potomac and the troops Harrison may have seen. Okay? The headquarters, 5th Corps, 2nd Cavalry Division, the Artillery Reserve, and Saul's Cavalry Division from the defenses of Washington are at or near Frederick. The 1st and 3rd Corps had moved to Middletown, Maryland. And so those are some of the troops Harrison may have accidentally walked into. And here's a general map of the whole movement. And you can see the one arrow pointing to Meade, it's actually pointing to Frederick. And the other arrow up at the top is pointing to Chambersburg. So that gives you an idea of the distance Harrison had to cover. Now, Major John W. Fairfax, another member of Longstreet's staff, apparently answering a question from Longstreet in a letter written in 1877, told him this, that Lee was very reluctant to make the move without confirmation by his cavalry, as he told me when I took Harrison to his tent the night of Harrison's arrival, under guard, as you state. He questioned me about my opinion of Harrison's veracity. My answer was, General Longstreet has confidence in him. And that was good enough for Fairfax. According to Fairfax, Harrison was not called into Lee's tent. And he went back, and when Fairfax went back to Longstreet's tent, he took Harrison with him. Okay? So according to Fairfax, Harrison didn't meet with Lee. Okay? On the other hand, Colonel Charles Marshall, who's a member of Lee's staff, remembered that Lee had just issued orders for the next day's march to Ewell and to A.P. Hill. When I was sent for by the commanding general, I found him sitting in his tent with a man in civilian clothing, in citizen's dress, who generally informed me was a scout of General Longstreet's, who had just been brought to him. He told me that this scout had left the neighborhood of Fredericktown that morning and had brought information that the Federal Army had crossed the Potomac and that its advance had reached Fredericktown and was moving thence westward towards the mountain. So we have one eyewitness who says Harrison didn't go into Lee's tent, and another eyewitness who said he did. So did he or didn't he? Well, I can tell you this. Fairfax's letter was written in 1877. Marshall's account wasn't published until 1927. And historians tend to think that the earlier reference is more reliable than the later one. And those are the only two references we have as to whether or not Lee personally met with Harrison. So Lee now is going to change his orders. He says preparations were now made to advance upon Harrisburg. But on the night of the 28th, information was received from a scout that the Federal Army, having crossed the Potomac, was advancing northward, and that the head of the column had reached the South Mountains. On the June 29th, for example, Lee is going to write to Lieutenant General Richard Ewell, commanding his Second Corps. I wrote to you last night, June 28th, stating that General Hooker was reported to have crossed the Potomac and is advancing by way of Middletown, the head of his column being at that point in Frederick County. Now, the one thing Harrison probably did not bring in was news of Hooker's replacement by George Meade. When he was in D.C., there were probably rumors of Hooker being replaced, but nothing definite. And Meade does not receive the official notice that he's now in command of the Army until 3 a.m. in the morning of June 28th. And he doesn't telegraph the General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, until 7 a.m. on June 28th. So there's a couple of hours between me getting the report and him telling Washington he's accepted and taken over. And so far, there's been no general announcement that this has happened. In other words, the White House doesn't put out a press release. Meade hasn't issued an order yet for the troops. So Harrison wouldn't know this was happening. The one name that was brought up that sort of strikes horror to the Lincoln administration is Major General George B. McClellan. Pennsylvania Congressman Kelly actually requested Lincoln that McClellan not be placed in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Newspaper editor A.K. McClure told the president that the people are clamoring for McClellan to be placed at the head of the Army. And Lincoln replied, "Do we gain anything by opening one leak to stop another? Do we gain anything by quieting one glamour merely to open another, and probably a larger one?" Apparently, Governor Joe Parker of New Jersey even wrote the president about McClellan's appointment. And Lincoln told him, "I really think the attitude of the enemy's army in Pennsylvania presents us the best opportunity we have had since the war began. I think you will not see the foe in New Jersey. I beg you to be assured that no one out of my position can know so well as if he were in it the difficulties and involvement of placing General McClellan in command." So the last person Lincoln is thinking of in command is George McClellan. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle, who was a lieutenant colonel in the British Coldstream Guards, was over here as an unofficial observer in the Confederate Army. And he reported that on June 30th, he had marched with Longstreet's column about 6 miles from Chambersburg to Greenwood, Pennsylvania. In the evening, Fremantle said, "General Longstreet told me that he had just received intelligence that Hooker had been disrated and that Meade was appointed in his place." So according to Longstreet, he doesn't know about the change until the evening of June 30th. So it's information obviously Harrison didn't bring him. And oddly, on June 30th, also on June 30th, Captain Lewis G. Young, the Assistant Adjutant General for J. Johnston Pettigrew's brigade, reported on the march to Gettysburg, we were passed by General Longstreet's spy, who quickly returned and informed General Pettigrew that Buford's division of cavalry, estimated at 3,000 strong, had arrived that day and were holding the town. Now, of course, the question is, how does Lewis G. Young know who Harrison is? Because they're completely different commands. Where it turns out that down in North Carolina, General Pettigrew on the left wrote to his superior, General D.H. Hill, on the right, on March 15, 1863, from Swift Creek, North Carolina. A scout from Street's Ferry, sent down for the purpose, reports that there is no doubt of the landing of a large force, and from the noise, he thinks they are fixing a pontoon over the Neuse to bring their infantry in. 2 days later, this is where you have to kind of put things together from the official records. 2 days later, Longstreet is writing to Hill, and he states, "Your telegram of report of the scout Harrison is received." So is the guy Pettigrew and Hill talking about Harrison? From Longstreet's telegram, it appears it just might be. And remember, this is March of '63, around the time Harrison's going to be captured by the Yankees. Fremantle also reported in his diary on July 1st that a spy who was with us insisted upon there being a pretty tidy bunch of bluebellies in or near Gettysburg. And he declared that he was in their society 3 days ago, which was placed at around June 27th or 28th. So this again could be Harrison. Moxley Searle, though, is going to state that Harrison really didn't have a lot to do around the camp. And so apparently once they got back to Virginia, Harrison asked for a leave of absence, and that was granted. He actually said he wanted to go to Richmond for a few days. And apparently during that time, Harrison and Searle met on a street in Richmond. And Harrison asked Searle if he wanted to take in a play. And Major Searle said, "What's the attraction?" And Harrison said, "Myself. I have made a bet of $50 greenback that I can play Cassius and play him successfully." Searle then asked, "Are you an actor?" And Harrison said, "No, but I can play." Okay. Anybody know where the character of Cassius is in a Shakespeare play? Know the name of the play? Julius Caesar. Very good. That's not the play Searle is going to describe. So let me get to that. So Searle took Harrison up, went to see the play. And he said Harrison's acting was if he had regularly strutted the boards for a stock company. But the play was rather lively at times. Othello was in drink. Cassius was really quite far gone, and even Desdemona was under more than one suspicion that evening. So I think Searle was getting his plays mixed up. Cassius, as we says in Julius Caesar, Cassio is in the play Othello. And that's the play he's describing, with Othello and Desdemona. But Searle also learned that Harrison had been drinking and gambling, not something you want a spy to do. Unless you're James Bond and win every time you gamble, you know. And Longstreet thought it better to let him go, and so directed me. Accordingly, I had him paid off with an order to report to the Secretary of War, from whom he had originally come. Now, Robert E. Lee and President Davis would meet on August 25th to talk about what's going on with the Army and the country. The final decision to send Longstreet and two of his divisions to Western Tennessee to reinforce General Bragg and the Army of Tennessee was made on September 5th. Longstreet returned to Army headquarters on September 7th, and by September 9th, Longstreet and his men are boarding trains heading down south to Georgia. Searle later said that Longstreet missed Harrison afterwards while we were in East Tennessee, and I made a careful effort to find him and bring him out to us. But apparently, Searle couldn't find him. Harrison is going to sign his last known pay voucher. Oops. He's going to sign his last known pay voucher on September 19th, 1863, first day of the Battle of Chickamauga. On September 28th, in 1863, he marries Laura Bruders in Washington, D.C., and then went on a pleasure trip to New York. Now, we know Harrison was in New York City on April 4th of 1864. Exactly what he was doing there, we don't know. But I can tell you that Confederate agents in New York City tried to burn the city in November of 1864. So whether Harrison's up there for an early attempt or a dry run, I don't know. There is a report in the official records from a person named Henry Gatlin, who was using the alias of Captain Harry S. Howard. He was a Union agent operating in Richmond, and he was sending some disturbing information to sort of his handler, Brigadier General Ben Butler, here on the left. And Butler's transmitting this to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, on the right. And basically, Butler is writing to ascertain by what means the rebels got intelligence from Washington. If you have such clerks as Judge Ord's brother-in-law and Harrison in your department, I think you will be safe in arresting them. Now, could this Harrison be Longstreet's Harrison? It could be. He's away from Longstreet's command. We know that. The Ord they're talking about is Robert Ord. He was the Confederate commissioner for prisoner exchange. And his brother-in-law is in the War Department. Apparently, it was pretty easy to get into the War Department, even during the Civil War. People were said to kind of walk in, look over the shoulder of the clerks, see what they're working on, and even walk off with papers that they pick up. So it was not exactly the secure presence you would hope for. Harrison was assigned his parole on August 21st, 1865 in New Orleans. He's going to take his wife and daughter, Elizabeth, who was born in 1864, to Mexico. Exactly what he's doing there, we don't know. He could have been working for the Emperor Maximilian, but Harrison and his family will leave Mexico probably sometime around when Maximilian is executed in 1867. Harrison does write to his wife, or Harrison had a second child born in July 1866 named Irene. On April 7th, 1866, now keep Irene's birth date in mind, okay? July 1866. In April of 1866, Harrison wrote to his wife from Baltimore, "I write on the eve of a journey and will not see you for some time, perhaps never." Now, how would you like to get that letter from your husband? And then there were two letters from Montana, written on August 27th, where Harrison apparently went out to prospect for gold. And he said, "As soon as he accumulates enough to get a home for you, I will return for you, and you shall yet be proud of the husband of your choice." A Washington friend had news of Harrison in 1867, and then after that, nothing. The family sent people out to try to find Harrison, and nobody could find him. So essentially, he's being declared dead, which means Laura, believing her first husband is dead, marries Reverend George Washington Rustin on August 27th, 1873. So she did leave some time in between. Harrison finally reappeared in Annandale, Virginia on November 19th, 1900. He's been gone since 1867. Finally showed up. Elizabeth, his one daughter, had moved to Illinois. And Irene's husband, James Robert Beatty, who she married in 1893, was against a reunion. Harrison wrote to his brother-in-law, or I guess at this point his ex-brother-in-law, since his wife had remarried, on November 21st, 1900, that he had been at Freestone, where I found Colonel Fairfax well and glad to see me. And that's John W. Fairfax of Longstreet staff. Oops. Moxley Sorrell remembered that while writing his memoirs around 1900, I hear from Latrobe, and this is Major Osmond Latrobe, another former Longstreet staff member, that the man Harrison is alive and in Baltimore, seeking some small assistance from the Confederate veterans. I should like to see his last days made comfortable. We know Harrison lived in Cincinnati until about 1901, where he worked as a detective on the Municipal Reform League. And he married a second time to Lucretia Allison, who was about 25 years his junior. And apparently he deserted her in Dayton, Ohio, and went back to Cincinnati. Yeah. An article in the Cincinnati Times-Star stated that Harrison took to sleuthing like a duck takes to water. Harrison passed away on October 28th, 1923, in Covington, Kentucky. And he's buried in Highland Cemetery, Fort Mitchell, Kentucky. For those who want to find it, it's section 18, grave 207. Okay? So how important was Harrison in all of this? Lee, in his July 31st, 1863 report, his first one, said preparations were now made to advance upon Harrisburg. He's talking about June 28th. But on the night of the 28th, information was received from a scout that the Federal Army, having crossed the Potomac, was advancing northward, and that the head of the column had reached the South Mountain. As our communications with the Potomac were thus menaced, it was resolved to prevent this further progress in that direction by concentrating our army on the east side of the mountains. In his second report of January 1864, Lee said, in the absence of the cavalry, it was impossible to ascertain his, meaning Hooker's, intentions, but to deter him from advancing further west and intercepting our communications with Virginia, it was determined to concentrate the army east of the mountains. So without Harrison's report, Lee probably would have started the whole army north to Harrisburg. Okay? One argument's been made that so long as Lee was in the Cumberland Valley of Pennsylvania, he was thinking sort of defensively. But once he moves over here to this valley, he's thinking more offensively. So a couple of reasons here. If Lee had continued this march to Harrisburg, George Meade, coming up with the Army of the Potomac, could have moved upon Lee's rear. He could have intercepted Lee's lines of communication and perhaps blocked his retreat back to Virginia, at which point we might be talking about the Battle of Carlisle or the Battle of Harrisburg instead of the Battle of Gettysburg. So you might be sitting in a city listening to this talk. I want to thank you folks for joining us this afternoon for the talk. Those who want to leave, feel free, and I'll be here in case anybody has any questions. Thank you.